The information in this podcast is provided for education and research information only. It is not a substitute for professional health advice.
Welcome to The Kick, your expert-led podcast helping you explore and learn everything about getting pregnant, pregnancy, birth and becoming a parent.
On the podcast and our online pregnancy program, Grow My Baby, we share my experience of helping more than 4,000 babies to be born.
And our experience of running a women's health clinic and parenting 4 boys.
We're here to help everyone to feel empowered in pregnancy and birth with real-life practical information.
Welcome everyone, I'm Brigid Maloney.
And I'm obstetrician Dr. Patrick Maloney.
And a big thank you for all of our returning listeners. We've got so many listeners that tell us that they hang out every week to hear our voices.
We've been listening since the start, which is awesome.
Yeah, which is this is our 6th year, Pat.
Fantastic.
We did have one whole year off in 2022.
Put our feet up. But apart from that, so there's quite a lot of back episodes now. Yeah. And it's just terrific that sometimes people find us and binge the whole lot. And some people have been listening all along.
Yes. And I know that we might have some new listeners, so perhaps for a little bit of context, let's just give a quick overview of who we are. How about that?
Perfect.
All right. I'll start.
You start.
Okay, good. Well, we are husband and wife. We have 4 boys and we run a women's clinic in our hometown, which is Ballarat Women's Clinic. And in the clinic, we've got a couple of O&Gs, which are obstetricians and gynecologists. That's what Australians call obstetrician and gynecologist, not OB-GYNs.
Not OB-GYN. Lots of people listening in America. We love that.
Yeah.
We love Americans.
That's right.
But here called O&Gs. Yeah.
Yeah. And sometimes we talk about, I talk about my 4 births. So just to put that into context for people, my first birth was an emergency caesarean. This was before I met Dr. Pat. The next one was a VBAC, which didn't work, another caesarean. And then in 2012, I met Dr. Pat and I had 2 planned caesareans. So sometimes we talk about that and people might think, hang on a minute, like how does that all fit in? But, it's just so for...
That's your story, that's our story?
Yeah. So for new listeners, that's us. So we are so thrilled to have you on board.
It is terrific that that you're listening, that you are engaging in this super important area, and an area that really grabs the interest and focus and imagination of people who are pregnant, perhaps for the first time, perhaps for the second or third time. Yeah.
And I know we have a global audience. Primarily, obviously, we talk about Australian obstetrics. But pregnant people are pregnant people.
Yeah. It's a near universal human experience that's the same the world over, give or take. Just some slight differences in international systems, testing, the way things are done. But obviously, the process itself is same around the world.
Yep. Great. All right. Well, I hope that helps people that are new to us, and welcome, a big welcome. Thanks for joining us.
What are we talking about today?
Well, we want to talk about a labour that's stalled.
Okay, good.
Yep. So I think maybe let's start by defining what part of the labour we're talking about.
It's important that we sort of have some sort of understanding about how this works, because it might be very relevant not only to the management of that situation on that day, but future pregnancies and so forth. So if the labour has stalled, there was the old-fashioned term of failure to progress. Is a bit unfortunate because it includes that failure word. It makes it sound like it's somebody's fault. So it kind of moved away from that into ideas, into terms such as non-progressive labour. And it could basically happen at any stage. It could be that the labour never really gets up and going. Waters break, nothing happens. And then we try and perhaps intervene to bring the labour on, and maybe it just doesn't happen. Or more commonly, it does start up, cervix does start to open, and at some point the progress is stalled.
Yeah. And this sort of starts being measured in active labour.
Yeah, it's a good idea to measure the progress to a certain degree just to make sure that things are moving in the right direction. But there's some debate as to exactly how fast it's supposed to go and exactly where the sort of goalposts are supposed to be to say that's too slow.
Yep.
Then there's some difference of opinion on that.
Yeah, and I really want to get into that.
Yeah, so we will get into that. But there's universal truth that when labour gets up and going, that it should remain somewhat progressive from that point.
Yeah, so we're not talking about when someone may be at home just having sort of niggles, not quite sure whether they're in, Yeah,
that's exactly what we're not talking about. And it's super important to know that to not be progressing at that stage is perfectly normal.
Yeah.
So it's not like the cervix starts to open with the first painful contraction and it keeps going at 1 centimetre an hour from then on. That's not right. And there are several hours, sometimes days, of relative inactivity of the cervix at the very, very start when we're in that latent phase of something's happening, but we aren't cooking along yet, having regular painful contractions that open the cervix.
All right, so that's what defines this active labour is, and when kind of you go on the clock, let's say.
Yeah, a little bit, yeah. So when we get into active labour, having regular painful contractions that are opening the cervix, then a degree of forward progression from that point onwards is wise. The question is what counts as normal and what doesn't.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What do people tell you that those painful contractions feel like, and what, as an obstetrician, are you looking for in those painful contractions?
Yeah, it's a good question because it varies enormously from woman to woman and pain tolerance to pain tolerance and so forth. What most people will tell you is that if they've been through a period of latent phase where they're getting some tightenings, some painful contractions at home, and then later come into the real deal, they can tell you in hindsight that it's very different.
Yeah.
That the pain is worse, that the intensity is much stronger. And they can tell you eventually that, okay, once I hit 3 or 4 centimetres and really started to cook along, then that was very qualitatively different to the contractions I was getting at home, 6 hours ago.
Yeah. Now, in my first labour, I had a very wishy-washy sort of stalled labour, and my contractions happened a lot but weren't useful. I know that I'm degrading myself here. They were useful, but, they just weren't going anywhere.
Yes.
So it's time and pain, is it? Like how can you tell a good contraction?
Well, you really can't. And so that because there's such variation between what people are experiencing, someone says, oh, it's terribly, terribly painful, it must be doing something. Sometimes people look at that at a CTG, a fetal heart rate trace, and it can show that there's a great big loop in the trace at the time of a contraction, and that just tells you that there is a contraction. It's not a measure of intensity.
Oh gosh!
So on that piece of paper coming out of that machine, if it looks like a really big deviation, that just means that the belt around your tummy is a bit tight. And if you loosen off the belt a little bit, it'll look like a little bump on the trace. So it doesn't measure intensity. It just says whether there's a contraction or not.
Oh my God, that is just like a light bulb moment for me, because in my VBAC, I had to wear a CTG the whole time.
Sure, yeah.
And I thought I was having these big, massive contractions, and I was really proud of myself because I couldn't feel it.
Yeah, right. Well, there you go. So it was just saying that there's a contraction there because when your uterus contracts, it changes the tension on that belt around your tummy, and the machine can pick that up, but it can't tell you how strong the contraction is, just whether it's there or not.
Oh.
So the whole point is we don't know. And this is why if someone appears to be in good labour, there's some value in internal examinations because nobody likes to stay in that latent phase forever. And it's very common for someone to say, well, I'm getting a lot of pain, and I'm still clearly in latent phase. It's not kicking on. How long do I have to put up with this? So eventually we in discussion with the woman might perform a vaginal examination to say, is the cervix opening or not?
Mm-hmm.
And if it's getting to the point where it is opening, then to a certain degree, it's hard to avoid the concept of being on the clock from then on.
Yeah.
Because once the cervix starts to open, we are looking for forward progress from that point onwards.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And sort of what time frame, like it might be worthwhile for our listeners to sort of talk about the time frames that you're looking for in an active labour.
Yeah, sure. So what we might do if we'd established that the cervix was definitely starting to open would be to talk to that about that woman at that point about to confirm her plans, her a desire for to just wait and let the situation progress entirely naturally, or whether there's room or need or evidence for intervention. And then, assuming everything's fine, check again 4 hours later.
And so for first-time births, I know that they're a little bit different in terms of the active labour stage than
Sure.
second time. How many hours for the whole active labour phase is what an obstetrician or a midwife is looking for in first and second time births or subsequent births?
Yeah, sure. So again, there's some variation in opinion on this, but I would think that it would be safe to say that once the labour is active enough that the woman is having regular painful contractions and the cervix has started to open, then it's reasonable to expect 0.5 to 1 centimetre of progress per hour from that point onwards for someone having their first baby. And we'll get in a little bit later into the different ways of measuring that and the evidence behind that being reasonable progress. But that would be the sort of progress that we would really like to see. It doesn't mean that if that progress is not there, we give up and do a section or something. No, there are ways of intervening to assess that, and there's some flexibility in waiting if mother and baby are well. For second and subsequent babies, it's very different. So there's a lot more variation. And whereas the progress for a first timer tends to be somewhat linear, the progress for a second and subsequent tends to be sort of nothing, kapow.
Mm.
Yeah. So you can have a very little change in the cervix, and then when the labour really, really kicks in, you could go from 3 centimetres to fully dilated in 1 hour very easily.
Yeah. Wow. Okay. So why did we start timing this phase?
Yeah, that's a really good question. That dates back to observations made in the early part of the 20th century, when they started to apply some scientific principles to the concept of labour and birth. And that's because in a lot of the world, the outcomes were pretty poor for a natural physiological process. And the number of women and babies not surviving the process of childbirth was unacceptably high. And in parts of the world, that's still somewhat true. So they started to look at the process, and one of the first things that they really observed was that labours that took way too long had the poorest outcomes.
Mm.
So then, for better or worse, they started to say, well, what can we do about that? That idea that the progress should be 0.5 to 1 centimetre an hour, that's called a Friedman rule, named after Dr. Friedman, who first described that. And it led to an understanding amongst medical carers in the birth space that there should be some quantifiable progress of about that amount in a healthy labour. And a common criticism of that is that it probably made too many rules, too narrow a definition of normal progress, and probably too much intervention in labours that might have been normal but slow.
And I did read that was in 1955, and the people that he studied were presumably white women in their 20s who were thinner.
Yeah.
A bit different from the cohort today. So does that make any difference?
Well, I think it would probably make a huge difference. So if he was studying a very healthy cohort of thin, healthy, young women, then firstly they would have been more likely to labour well in the first place. And then the ones that didn't were a more obvious outlier who probably had a more genuine problem.
Mm.
He wasn't dealing with the same cohort that we're dealing today, where the first timers are older and heavier, and where there are more proven justifiable indications for induction of labour.
Oh, yeah.
So, the data for induction of labour for severe obesity, very strong. You are better off if you're severely obese, give or take, with the term induction. There's more gestational diabetes.
Yeah.
So more people being induced And that's where we're perhaps not comparing apples with apples between that Friedman cohort and today. But for all the criticisms of making rules about labour, it's supposed to go this fast, it should go this fast, one thing they did achieve were colossal improvements in safety for women and babies by applying some scientific principles to the birthing process throughout the developments that were made in the 20th century. Because
it is still a criticism today that, that births are monitored too hard and then decisions to intervene are made too fast. But there was another person that studied it later, isn't it? Dr. Zhang in 2010.
Yeah, this is interesting. So the Zhang approach was to try and make a new partogram, a new way of assessing labour, progress in labour that allowed for the different curves between first birth. We can have latent progress at the start, active progress at a certain point, and they were hoping that that new way of analysing normal progress might have created a new safety pathway that would result in less intervention and, in particular, less caesarean sections. And I think that way of looking at it does take into consideration the actual physiological process of normal first birth, and certainly the normal physiological progress of second and subsequent births. But unfortunately, it hasn't led to fewer interventions, and it hasn't led to fewer caesarean sections. And that's a bummer. It would have been really nice if it did. But what I think it's highlighted is that there is benefit in understanding the physiological process as best we can before we start putting limits on it and saying what's normal and what's not.
Yeah, and not being so heavily protocolized and saying, okay, so that woman came in at this time and therefore we expect her to have got to 10 centimetres dilated in 8 hours' time, whatever.
Yeah, that's right, because what I think the holy grail of modern obstetrics is that we should be trying to be, as cautious as we can about unnecessary intervention, but also practicing obstetrics in a way that maintains the safety gains that were achieved in the 20th century. We don't go backwards in safety. And I think that's our big challenge, how to keep the safety and the awesome outcomes in the developed world without overdoing intervention.
Yeah. All right. So I think this part of the podcast has all been for perhaps birth care workers themselves and women who are really motivated to find out the nuts and bolts. And we've got a lot of people that like to hear all that.
If anyone's new to the podcast, a lot of our listeners don't shy away from the nitty gritty.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, and they're actually listening to hear an expert and experienced medical practitioner's view, but we try not to give only that.
Yeah. So what we're going to move on to is for those people who either had a birth where the labour stalled and then all this intervention happened and they want something to explain that, or someone that's going into a birth and what should they expect if they're
concerned about that? Yeah.
Good. Labour has stalled. Confirmed.
Sure.
Stalled labour. Are you worried about the progress being too slow or a stalled labour more?
A stalled labour more.
Yeah.
But if we, if we're thinking about not just identifying that, but to sort of say to that person, what are we going to do next? This is where we have to stop, take a big breath, and try and take a whole woman and baby view of what's going on and why this appears to have happened.
Right.
And one of the dangers of an entirely protocolized flowchart approach is that you might say, oh, well, this lady was 4 centimetres at 3 p.m. and she's still 4 centimetres at 7 p.m. and yet she's been having regular painful contractions that whole time. What are we going to do? Okay, well, we'll break the waters and put up some Syntocinon and try and push her along harder. But there may be limited benefit of doing that if she's already been having terrifically strong contractions. So we might say, well, hang on a minute, what appears to be the problem here? And you take a step back from the end of the bed and you can see that, hang on a minute, this appears to be an enormous baby.
Yeah.
A petite woman. Maybe this is a square peg in a round hole problem and this baby's too big to fit out. So we have to sort of have at least a go at assessing, at least an attempt at assessing why the problem might be happening, and then making a sensible suggestion of an intervention based on what we think the problem is.
Yeah.
And this is where obstetrics is a little bit of science and a little bit of art. Sometimes you can tell from experience that, okay, here's a problem that I think we can fix by improving the contractions, and here's a problem that perhaps I think we can't fix at all.
Yeah. So big baby and small pelvis, those things you sort of, you probably have an idea about the big baby before the labour, but you wouldn't know what the size of that woman's pelvis. Some
people think that they can tell by looking at the woman on the outside.
Yeah.
But if you look at someone's hips on the outside, that's just the bony part of their hips. You can't see the inlet where the baby comes down. So we don't know how wide that is at all.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I have a sister who's 12 years older than me. I should know off the top of my head, but I don't. And she, back in her day, they would take x-rays of pelvises. She had an x-ray of her pelvis to see whether her pelvis was too small.
Yeah, right. So that's the old pelvimetry, and it didn't work.
No.
Yeah. As a science, it didn't hold up.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right.
It didn't take into consideration stretching of the pelvis, squishing with the baby's head, and so forth.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we don't do that anymore.
Yeah.
Not to mention you're giving a baby an x-ray.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, that's right. So you've talked about somebody that's having what you see as good contractions. What's another reason why they may not be progressing?
So a lot of this, most of this perhaps, is malposition of the fetal head, so that the baby is just not in a good position to be coming down with its chin tucked down against the chest and the small diameter of the baby's head presenting down into the pelvis.
Yeah.
Remember, a baby's head looks more like an Australian football, which is oval shaped, than a soccer ball or the football that's round. And so it's got a long diameter and a short diameter, and the baby wants to be tucked in so that the small aspect of the head is presenting down into the pelvis. So if we think that's the problem, to a certain degree, that can be assessed by vaginal examination, by external examination, and sometimes by ultrasound examination. And then, for example, the example I mentioned before, where the woman might be having terrific contractions, but the progress is not there, then on vaginal examination we may also be able to find, through the partially dilated cervix, that the baby's head is developing what's called caput, which is like swelling around the head, or moulding, where the bones of the head seem to be overlapping each other. And if we're in a position where we think there's a lot of caput and moulding, and there's no progress, then that may be an uncorrectable situation that definitely needs a caesarean section. By contrast, we might have somebody who's made very little progress over 4 hours, but the contractions have been a bit ordinary. And on examination, there's no caput, there's no moulding, the fetal position looks good, and the problem seems to be the power of the uterus to push the baby out. Well, in that situation, we might be very wise to break the waters, put up some syntocin on, and improve the quality of the contractions.
Yeah.
And that could put the whole thing back on track.
Yeah, that's N=1. But that's what I wish had have happened in my first birth. When you weren't around, Pat, where were you?
Well, yeah, that is a danger of a very hands-off approach.
Mm.
And there are some people who really come into that first birth fully wanting a hands-off approach, entirely hands-off approach, but perhaps not understanding the benefits of a hands-on approach if the progress is poor.
Yeah.
Yeah. So sometimes people are very surprised to hear that they may benefit from intervention.
Yeah.
Which is really strange, because I don't know why intervention would ever have been invented if it wasn't with benefit in mind.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we've lost a sort of educational battle there as obstetricians, because if intervention is seen as such a problem, and only a cause of problems, then we've failed in the task of educating people about the potential benefits.
Mm.
So, for example, if someone's having a labour where they're clearly cracking along, listen to the fetal heart after every contraction, baby's totally happy, woman's huffing and puffing, gets to fully dilate and push the baby out, what are we going to intervene in that labour for? Entirely unnecessary. And in fact, interventions in that labour could only cause harm. But if somebody's labour is stuck at 4 centimetres over 6, 7, 8 hours, intervention is only going to help that person get that labour back on track and get to their original goal, which was a vaginal birth.
Which kind of, the first vaginal birth does help to set up your second and subsequent births as well, doesn't it? You know, so
entirely.
Yeah.
Yeah. So if we look at the whole situation, not just for that birth, but over the woman's obstetric lifetime, then some judicious intervention to get that labour back on track. If that results in that baby being born vaginally, then give or take the other babies will come vaginally as well.
Yeah.
The clincher is the mode of delivery of the first baby.
I want to go back to the intervention that you may use if there is positioning of the baby's head.
Yep.
Is there anything else you can do, or can you only have to wait until it gets in the actual birth canal and the pushing phase to perhaps tuck the head in and, you know?
Yeah, interventions to improve that tend to be focused on before full dilatation. Then they're focused on the fact that if you improve the contractions in a lot of cases, then the uterus will push the head down better, and the pelvic floor is shaped in such a way that it usually, but not always, will get the fetal head in a good position. Yeah. So the interventions before full dilatation are usually focused on improving the strength and efficiency of the contractions.
Yeah.
If someone's at full dilatation and the head's way down and the head's not pointing in the right direction, there are some interventions that can correct that with the use of forceps and vacuums, but that's a different subject.
Yeah. Different episode topic.
Yeah.
Good. All right. So we've talked about the tools in your toolkit, the obstetrician's toolkit, if there's intervention. So just to recap, it's breaking the waters.
Yeah, that seems to help in itself, improve the quality of contractions, probably by removing the water that's between the head and the cervix and letting the head push more effectively against the cervix.
Putting up a syntocinon drip?
Yeah. Yep. So careful and safe and judicious use of syntocinon to make the contractions come more strongly and efficiently. Try and get up to contractions that last that 60 to 90 seconds, 4 to 5 in 10 minutes.
What about, I know we've talked about previously, sometimes an epidural can do the opposite of what we all think, and that is that it can, if at that stage, it can help someone relax. There's
a few schools of thought on how epidurals will work. I mean, they take the pain away. That's brilliant. But how do they work to make labour seem to go better? They certainly achieve a state where because the pain's gone, if we're using syntocinon, we can use more.
Yeah.
We can use enough to get contractions that are longer and more frequent. And that can put a labour back on track. And that's easier to do if by blasting that syntocinon, you are not causing the woman excessive pain. Then there are some abnormalities of a fetal heart rate trace, which, for example, the fetal heart rate appearing to go too fast, which you might see if the woman's heart rate is going too fast, which you might see if she was excessively stressed or in pain. And so you can use an epi in that situation to in a sense, relax the woman and things that seem to go better. And lastly, of course, the epi can be used to sort of block some of the pain of painful interventions that might be done at full dilatation. And these are all of the ways in which an epi might actually improve your chances of having a vaginal birth. Okay, again, a controversial statement. It's not what people expect to hear, because we know that there are some issues with using an epidural and then requiring more intervention. There are just as commonly some situations where the careful use of an epidural might help you to get to full dilatation in the first place, which kind of gets you to the starting line of a vaginal birth. And had you never had that epidural, you may have had a section for various reasons.
Yeah.
So there aren't bad tools; they're just bad ideas. And the right tools used at the right time may actually get us back on track for the desired vaginal birth.
One other thing, it's always, these are what happens to a woman, but there's things that she can do as well. Like she can move. Yep. Change positions, listen to what the midwife's saying about, hey, you've been on your back for a long time. How about we swap it around and get back on a Swiss ball, or, if she's been in the bath forever, like maybe it's time to get out of that bath and how about we stand for a little bit, or have your partner support you? Absolutely.
We know that changes in position can certainly help at full dilatation to get to a point where you develop an irresistible urge to push. Whether changes in position are very important during the dilating phase of the cervix, of first stage of labour, is less clear, but we think that for as long as possible, being mobile helps.
It also helps from a psychological point of view, I think. It makes you feel like you're doing something.
I know, and it's a long time, right?
Yeah.
It's very, very unusual that we would spend, 10, 15 hours in one room, in one place.
I think that is all I wanted to ask you about if a labour stalls. If we haven't actually answered your question about a stalled labour, we're still here. Pop it on the speak pipe. I think that would be a really great idea, and just say, hey, what about in this situation if I was to do blah, blah? We love those questions.
Yeah. Or tell us about your labour. It did this and it stopped. What was that all about?
Yeah.
Because it's common for me to meet people who've had a labour that didn't do what they wanted it to do the first time around, and they still have an incomplete understanding of that a couple of years later when they're ready to have another baby.
Yeah.
So, if you've got a story and a question, we'd be keen to hear it.
All right, everyone. Well, that's it for this week. I hope you've enjoyed this episode. And if you enjoy the type of education that we provide in the free podcast, you might also enjoy the free newsletter, which is a week-by-week newsletter, which marries up with your week of pregnancy. And that can lead to our program, which is a more in-depth discussion on each topic as well. So all of that can be found at our website, which is growmybaby.com.au, or just pop into the show notes in either Apple Podcast or Spotify, and the links will be all there. We hope that you have a wonderful week, and we'll be in your ears next week.
Thanks for listening, everybody.
Bye for now.